On behalf of the Women's Center, welcome to Swimming Against the Tides in Pin Curls and Cronolyn with Susan Campbell. Susan Campbell is an award-winning author of a memoir, Dating Jesus, and the biography Tempest Tossed, The Secret of Isabella Beecher Hooker. Campbell has a bachelor's degree from the University of Maryland and a master's degree from Harvard Seminary. For more than a quarter century, she was a columnist at the Hartford Courant, where her work was recognized by the National Women's Political Caucus, New England Associated Press News Executives, and the Society for Professional Journalism, and many more. When conversing with featuring speakers, we asked them about their legacy and what they want to leave with Eastern. When asked, Campbell responded with a lesson she learned from Sunday school. You aren't here just for yourself, you're here for everyone, and you should act that way. Campbell joins us today to speak about a historic Connecticut figure who paved the way for human rights in the U.S., Isabel Beecher Hooker. Please join me in welcoming Susan Campbell.
Do I have to stand there? Great. I don't like standing there. I feel like I'm in church at a pulpit. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for dragging in late. You are my people. I first met Isabella Beecher Hooker about 12 years ago, and I met her, and as I was saying, I was assigned to write about her for the Hartford Courant. And I was mad because I'd never heard of her. And I was mad because here I had to go out and do research. Blech. So I argued that maybe I should write about Harriet Beecher Stowe, her far more famous half-sister, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. If you're like most people, you have pretended to read Uncle Tom's Cabin. You haven't actually read it, don't lie. Me too. So I have never read the whole thing. I've read portions of it, but it's very dense and it's very Victorian. Have you read it? Have you tried? It's hard. It's like reading Shakespeare, and once you get your mind there, it's okay, but it's difficult to read. So this friend of mine at the Courant decided that three of us, female journalists, would take the three public Beecher sisters and write about them, write little bios about them. The Beecher family were known as the Fabulous Beecher. Everybody was famous, except one sister, Mary, who chose not to be famous. We weren't going to write about her. So we wanted to write about the Beecher women. There were four altogether. Again, Mary wasn't famous. What are you going to say about her? She had a nice life. She lived in Hartford. She married an attorney. That's about it. So we're not going to write about her. We were going to write about Catherine Beecher, who was the older sister. Are any of you older sisters? Okay, don't listen. You know how older sisters are, right? They're bossy and they know everything. That was Catherine Beecher. No offense, older sisters. And in a way, she had to be that way because her mother died and there were 8 children, and she had to step in when she was 20 and basically be the family matriarch. Then there was Harriet Beecher Stowe. I already mentioned Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is the second most purchased and unread book after the Bible. It still sells out. It's incredible. And you cannot overstate the impact that that book had on our culture. It was written as a magazine serial in early 1850s, and it ran in chapters, and people couldn't wait for the next chapter. And what Harriet Beecher Stowe did was she took slavery and brought it to your parlor. If you were living in the North, then you could think about slavery down there, those nasty Southerners. In fact, your economy was built on the slave economy from the South. If you were in the South, you didn't necessarily support slavery, but you did support the economy. And then there were the horrible plantations. If you've seen 12 Years a Slave, that doesn't begin to address how awful it was, what a bankrupt, social, ugly thing that slavery was. And people would talk about it, particularly in the North, and they would talk about it as if it was the South's problem. But Harriet Beecher Stowe, from living where the Underground Railroad, where people who had been enslaved were escaping to freedom, would pass through in Ohio, she took their stories and wrote this searing book, if you can get through the language, that breaks your heart. She made it real. And then there was Isabella. Whatever. She was a younger half-sister. Let me explain a little bit about the Beechers. Get a pen out because everybody has the same name. The patriarch of the family was Lyman Beecher. Lyman Beecher was a minister, kind of the same religion that I come from, a fundamentalist Christian minister. Y'all are going to hell except me. And he would preach on a Sunday out in Litchfield, Connecticut, and he would run from the back of the church, leap over the pews, land in the pulpit, and preach for 9 hours. And he'd send you and you and you and you to hell. Y'all going to hell. People loved him. If you're in Litchfield, Connecticut, and it's the 1800s, what else are you going to do for entertainment? You're going to go see Brother Beecher rip you a new one. It was awesome. People loved him. He believed that the devil truly walked the earth, that the devil was as real as my coat right there, and that you had to fight continually against the devil because the devil was tempting you. If you've ever gone to church where this kind of sermon goes, you get all wrapped up in it, right? I miss those scary, let's get your ass to church sermons. That's what he gave every Sunday. And he would preach until he was so exhausted. In fact, he had to take a year off once, and all he did was plow the same field in Litchfield, follow behind a horse. So exhausted. He'd probably have a diagnosis now. But in fact, he'd get down on the floor and play with his children. And as much as he was a scary preacher, he believed that his daughters deserved an education. Now, this is the early 1800s. That was pretty radical. But he was a minister, and as influential as he didn't have any money. So he would trade and teach at this one incredible female school, Miss Pierce boarding school, Miss Sarah Pierce's boarding school. He would teach theology in exchange for his daughters being able to attend classes there. And unlike most of the other female training academies, they weren't just learning how to knit or cook or keep a house. They were learning physics and math, and it was incredible. It was very, very radical for that time. And it influenced Catherine. Have you heard of Catherine? See, you're unusual. Most people haven't. There's actually a dormitory at CCSU, Catherine Beecher. First time I saw it, and it's spelled Catharin. I know it's her. My jaw dropped. I thought, oh, cool. She was an education reformer based on what she learned and her father's push that she learn everything that men learned at the time. She became this incredible educational reformer and wanted all girls to have the same education as boys. Then you had Harriet, wrote the best-selling novel ever. All the boys, and there were 8 of them, became ministers. Can you imagine sitting around the table with 8 ministers every Thanksgiving? Except this was a time when if you were in the clergy, you were somebody. It wasn't really the captains of industry or even the politicians who had all the influence, all the power. It was a minister. It was so different from today. If Henry Ward Beecher, one of the brothers, if he gave a sermon, it would be reprinted and then distributed and discussed. Do any of you go to church and talk about the sermon other than to say Jesus is long? They would discuss the sermon. That was the kind of influence that a minister had at the time. So all 8 boys are ministers. You have Mary, who's quietly married to a Hartford lawyer. You had Harriet, this incredible writer. Catherine was an incredible writer as well. She was also a speaker. She was a single woman making a living, speaking and writing. And she wrote about kind of Martha Stewart stuff. How to keep your house perfect. How to raise your children. Never married, never raised children, but she wrote about it, made a living. She did raise her siblings. She was engaged for a while, Catherine, to this brilliant mathematician from Yale University, and he got killed in a shipwreck. And he bequeathed to her all of his books. She read all those, and that fueled her interest in education. Are you getting the idea? This is an incredible family. The press called them the fabulous Beechers. They were like the Kennedys on crack without all the sex scandals. There was one sex scandal. We'll get to that later. I know you'll listen for that part. And here comes Isabella. But I have to preface her coming here in that Lyman was married to his intellectual equal, which was unusual at the time, a woman named Roxana Foote from Guilford. She was so incredibly smart. She would prop her French book up on her distaff so that while she wove cloth, she could practice her French. She came from a family of really incredibly smart women who expected the women to be smart, and not just on household stuff, but period, smart. She married Lyman. They had 8 children. He wore her out and she died. She died at the age of 41, which to some of you sounds ancient. I don't even remember being 41. It was so long ago. He wore her out. What it said was she died of consumption, which was kind of a catch-all disease. It could have been something with her lungs. It could have been she just decided this is a lot of work, I'm going to go, and died. A year to the day that Roxana died, Reverend Beecher, Lyman Beecher, goes to Boston to find the second Mrs. Beecher. Everybody knew what he was doing. He found one. He found the most inappropriate woman imaginable, in that she came from a lot of money. She had no experience with children, and he dragged her out to Litchfield from Boston to live in a world she had no clue what to do. She had 8 grieving children. Henry Ward Beecher once said that the moment Roxana died, her remaining children lifted her to the status of sainthood. He said the way Roman Catholics look at the Virgin Mary, those Beecher kids looked at their dead mother, Roxana. And here's where it gets confusing. Her name was Harriet as well, Harriet Foote. She goes out to Litchfield, and she has Lyman Beecher, who's preaching 9 hours a Sunday, and then he has all the duties meant for a minister. She's supposed to be a minister's wife, which was a pretty prescribed role. She has 8 crying children. She immediately goes to the bedroom and locks the door. It's too much. We know that Lyman visited her at least 3 times. She had 3 children. The first one was Isabella Beecher. She was born February 22nd, 1822 in Litchfield, in a house that's still there, but it's been dismantled. And it's stuck in someone's barn, and he won't let go of it. And I keep calling him up to see if I can go see it. I don't get it. He's a weird guy. But anyway, she was born into this, what was going to be an incredibly influential family, but not a lot of money. 2 siblings followed, and she's being reared by a mother who's kind of absent. So her older sisters stepped in, and they had embraced their father's theology in that the devil's walking the earth. Every day is a trial. You have to beat the devil. And they hounded her. If you can imagine, I don't know if any of you are living this life, 3 older sisters watching your every move. It got a little much. And Lyman would get overwhelmed, and eventually the family moved from Litchfield to Boston when Isabella was about 3 or 4. And his church, Lyman's church, was on a corner where on the other 3 corners were also churches. And they used to call it the Brimstone Corner. And little boys would open up Lyman Beecher's church door and see if they could smell brimstone from hell, and then close it really quick. He had a reputation. They stayed there for just a few years, and then he got an offer to go be a dean at a school out in Ohio, which at that point was the westernmost portion of the United States. And he went out there. Now remember, this is in a time in the 1830s, 1850s, where people are starting to talk about this thing called slavery. There had always been opposition to slavery. The Quakers opposed it from the get-go. But it was starting to be a conversation that more people were having, and it was a pretty heated conversation. The place where Lyman Beecher ended up was Lane Seminary. And it's hard to explain. I never learned this growing up. I thought you were for slavery or you were against it. There was no middle ground. In fact, you could be against slavery at that time, but then there was a lot of discussion as to what happened when slavery was ended. You had people like most of the Beechers who believed that slavery should end, and then the people who had been enslaved get shipped back to Africa. Except some of those people had been here for generations. They had everything to do with Liberia that I do. So they were here. This was their culture. Other abolitionists, people who opposed slavery, believed you free the people who'd been enslaved, you enfranchise them as full citizens, they get to vote, they get to own property, we're done. That was the most radical you could be. Most of the Beechers felt that you should ease into that notion. You free them, you send them to Africa, we're good. They were called the colonizers. And if you've read Uncle Tom's Cabin, and most of you have admitted you didn't, she pulls her punches in the end. Harriet Beecher Stowe believed in colonization. All the main African-American characters go to Africa. Problem solved, except it wasn't, and it wasn't realistic. So you had people having this discussion, and at Lane Seminary they had these debates where the students, who were pretty radical at the time, argued that colonization wouldn't work. And it was a way that white Americans were trying to absolve themselves of the issue they created by bringing over the first people in the hold of a ship chained up. So that bothered Lyman Beecher terribly. It hurt his heart because he thought slavery was bad, but we have to move slowly. Have you ever heard that? Like when you have a political discussion and someone says, I agree with you, but we have to move slowly on this. Yeah, that's great, unless you're a slave. And then, you don't have that much time. So this big discussion went on, and Isabella, meanwhile, is growing up in Ohio. And she's kind of a little feral, in a way, a feral child. She ends up being shipped around to her older siblings' homes. Now, I have a little sister, she's 14 years younger, and she lived with us for a while. And when my husband and I would have an argument, we didn't clean it up because she's a member of the family. I didn't worry what she was hearing. The same thing happened to Isabella, except unlike my sister, she's listening really closely. And she heard her sisters fight for some kind of independence in their marriage, and she heard her brothers being what she considered to be a little heavy-handed about the whole throne thing, you're the king of the castle, whatever. And she took all that in. And meanwhile, this trial goes on, and then her mother dies. She made the trip out to Ohio, but she didn't survive much longer. Then her father is sued in court. This is how important theology was at the time, for blasphemy, by this minister who basically was jealous because Lyman Beecher had more influence on the culture, and that trial didn't go anywhere. But there's Isabella and all this, and she's now an orphan. She has no mother. Her father loves her, but he's not home. He's running a school, he's fighting his way through court, he's administering to his dying wife, who also, by the way, died of consumption. I swear, Lyman Beecher wears women out. And by the way, a year to the date when Harriet died, he went and got another wife. This time, he got a wife who already had kids, and they didn't have any children between them. Thank God. That's 13. That's probably enough. So there's Isabella. So she's going from older sibling to older sibling's house, and meanwhile, those Beechers were incredible letter writers. And they'd grown up poor, right? Their father's a minister. So what they would do is they would write letters to each other on the same page. So Catherine would start out and write to Harriet. Harriet would write to Henry Ward. Henry Ward would add a line to Charles. Charles would send it to Thomas. And they would then flip it over on the back, and then they would write around the margins. And all those letters, or a lot of them, are at the Stowe Center in Hartford. So if you sit down and read those letters, and I did, you have like the best salon with the smartest people. You have a transcript of a conversation with the smartest people in the room. So when I got assigned Isabella, and I was mad, I was sick the day they assigned the daughters. I get her, and I thought, fine, I'll do it. And then my second thought was, no one's ever heard of her. So no one's going to call up with a correction. I can say anything I want. Yay! There's not going to be someone out in stores who's some scholar who knows about Isabella Beecher Hooker who's going to call up and say, she did not. They don't know her. So I go over to the Stowe Center, and I start educating myself about this woman. And I'm reading these letters in the spidery handprint, and I'm thinking, ooh, good one. And every time one of those transcript letters, every time I stopped, it was something Isabella had written. And I'm thinking, oh, she gives as good as she gets. That's great. This was when she was a little older. One of those letters contains a three-way conversation between Mary, Catherine, and Harriet, just the girls. And they're worried about Isabella. Her mother has died. She's 13. And the concern from Catherine, the bossy older sister, is all she does is talk about hair and fashion. If you remember, young women, being 13, that's all you talked about too, but you're not a Beecher. If you're a Beecher, more is expected of you. So they decided they can't leave her out there with Lyman. He's never around. She needs to come live with Mary. Mary, the quiet one, the one who's not public, the one who lives in Hartford with a wealthy attorney, her husband. She'll go to Hartford. That made all the difference. They shipped her out. She was complaining about it. She really liked Ohio. Ohio was interesting. Cincinnati had a lot going on. She knew nothing of Hartford. She didn't even remember being in Litchfield. She liked Cincinnati. It was called Porkopolis. A lot of pigs wandering around. You could ride the pigs in the streets. Cool. You can't do that in Hartford. In Hartford, it was so genteel. They had blue-suited gentlemen who would sweep the streets daily. They called them the Bluebirds. They had opera, Richardson's Opera on Main Street. They had huge churches. In fact, Hartford had 12 book publishers, 12. Hartford had more publishers than New York had. It's what brought Mark Twain here because his publisher was based in Hartford originally. So she's sent to far-off Hartford and she's mad. And within a nanosecond of arriving here, she meets a guy. She meets John Hooker. Now remember, her brother-in-law, Isabella's brother-in-law, Thomas Perkins, was an attorney in Hartford. Back then, if you wanted to be an attorney, you could go to a law school. They certainly existed, but you tended to be an attorney, a male, sorry girls. You just clerked at an already practicing attorney's office, and then you got your chops, and then you were an attorney. Thomas Perkins' clerk was John Hooker of the Thomas Hooker clan that settled Connecticut. So he came with this wonderful pedigree, and he grew up in Farmington, and he looked the part of a quintessential Caucasian Yankee, and he was the biggest radical known to humankind. But no one knew that. He was an abolitionist, and he was what was called a whole-souled, S-O-U-L-E-D, abolitionist. You don't just free the slaves and put them on another ship and send them to Africa. You free the slaves, you enfranchise them as citizens, and you treat them as the brothers and sisters that they are. When he talked like that, in fact, he wrote an autobiography that's almost unreadable. I hope someone writes a biography on him someday because there was no structure. But it was interesting because he remembers being a kid in Farmington and being in a church, and there was an abolitionist, a whole-souled abolitionist preaching, and someone threw rocks through the window and just missed the speaker, and John Hooker was so impressed because the speaker never stopped. I will say this, and I'm not even going to acknowledge that a rock just almost beamed me in the head. He was from an incredible family. His father was an educator. His mother was every bit as educated, and he was going through life as this radical who was going to be an attorney. But he got away with it because he was a hooker, just as Isabella was a Beecher. Much was expected of him. He was like the royalty of Connecticut. And he saw Isabella at his boss's house and said, so uncool, we're going to be married. And she was 17, and she said, no, we're not. I want to marry you. I don't want to marry you. And she didn't even know who he was. That is so uncool. So he explained to her that he was going to marry her, and she could wait if she wanted to, but they would marry. And she explained to him, first of all, my name is Isabella, good to meet you. But secondly, I have seen my siblings' marriage up close, and I know what happens to women in marriage. They disappear. I do not want that. I'm a Beecher. My older sister, Catherine, is supporting herself as a single woman. I believe I will do the same. Thank you, no. So John Hooker took one step back, took one step forward, and said, we will be married. And he kept at it. And he started to give her, now again, she knew of abolitionism, what she thought she saw out at Lane Seminary in the debates that hurt her father's feelings so much because the students were so much more radical than he was. And he was concerned that their radicalization would keep funders from giving money to his school. It sounds really mercenary, but it was true. So here's John Hooker saying, no, you can't just send people back to where they've never come from. You have to give them all the rights as full citizens. And she's thinking, I don't think, none of my siblings think like that. And he starts feeding her books and articles, and she starts reading them, and she's incredibly quick to pick up, he's right. And she starts inserting into those family letters, the round robin ones, you know, we've been wrong. We're Beechers, and we need to be leaders in this, and colonization is not the answer. Now, this was a family that moved as one. And you got along best if you just agreed with each other. Even though you could have your arguments on the side, you needed to be a Beecher. We circle the wagons. And when her sister Harriet wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, pulled her punches, and colonized everyone at the end in this fictional thing, she moved into her sister's house to answer the letters, to be a support. This was a little bit down the road, but here she is being the radical among the Beechers, but she's still not getting married. So John Hooker keeps after her. We're going to get married. I don't want that kind of marriage that your siblings have. I would abhor that. I want you as an intellectual equal. We will create our own marriage. Please don't think I'm that small that I want anything less. So same way I got married, I hounded the man until he said, yes, you just keep at them. They'll give in eventually. She finally said, look, we'll be engaged. And if in 2 years' time, in that time, if you don't see someone you like better, we'll get married. But if someone comes along you think is more appropriate, take that opportunity. And here's what she was risking by doing that, by saying that. Back then, an engagement was considered a legal contract. And it was the last contract a woman could agree to, and her marriage contract was the last contract she would ever sign. Because legally, she then disappeared under the right arm of her husband, never to be heard from again. I would not be Susan Campbell. I would be Mrs. Frank Chavone. It's not my name, but that's how the law had it. And she did not want that. By saying she would marry him, she was entering into a legal contract. If he did find someone he liked better and chose to marry the other woman, she would be ruined. Because the assumption was if the engagement did not culminate in a marriage, the woman did something wrong. She was probably slutty. And that reputation would hound her, which would close all kinds of doors for her, including the independent life she planned for herself. So it was pretty gutsy and kind of stupid. But John Hooker said, fine, 2 years. And they exchanged letters back and forth. As an attorney, he traveled a lot, and those letters are preserved at the Stowe Center. And I'm reading every one of them. And I'm thinking, this is the best love story, because who doesn't want an intellectual equal like this? And they would fight back and forth, and sometimes he would win, sometimes she would win. And at 2 years' time, she wrote him the least romantic letter ever and said, okay, my family's in town in August. Let's get married then. And they did. That was it. They got married. She borrowed a dress, they got married, and they moved out to Farmington to live with his parents. That was common. And he built his law practice up. Now, he had gone to Yale. I forgot to say, the Beechers did not want him to be an attorney. If you're a Beecher, you have to be a minister. Even though his last name was Hooker, he was now entering the Beecher panoply, and he had to be a minister. So the family started putting the screws to him. Directly after the marriage and a few weeks before, you need to go to Yale Divinity School because all men of quality are in the pulpit. Not an attorney, not good. You need to be a minister. And he tried. He went for a month and thought, no, I don't want to do this. The one Beecher, including Isabella, the one Beecher who didn't hound him, weirdly, was Catherine. She was the bossiest one, but she kept telling her family, shouldn't he choose his own profession? Can we at least give him that? And he did. But while he was at Yale earlier, he'd gotten sick, he missed like a year of school, and then he read a lot to try and catch up, and he ruined his eyes. He had poor eyesight the rest of his life. Now, he was still reading Blackstone's commentary. If you're a lawyer or pre-law, you know what that is. But he couldn't read it very well because of his eyesight, so Isabella would read Blackstone's commentary to him at night, and he would read the Hartford Courant to her in the morning. And she was coming across this one part that talked about marriage, and she hit the part that said, when a woman marries, the two become one, and the man becomes the head of the household. And she threw the book across the room. I told you this is what it would be. And he kept trying to reassure her, no, that's not our marriage. We don't have to have that marriage. It put her in such a funk. She couldn't get out for the longest time. Then the babies started coming. She had a son, Thomas. He died before he was 2, and it destroyed her. Now, remember, her mother was shut up in her bedroom, mostly in Litchfield and then in Boston. She'd been raised by her siblings, mostly her sisters, and she didn't have a real good understanding of what a mother is. So when Thomas died, probably of diphtheria, she collapsed within herself, and she started keeping motherhood journals because she was trying to work out, how do I be a good mother? I don't really know. And her sisters weren't much help because they weren't good mothers either. They were either absent or Catherine, not a mother, can't go to her for advice, even though she wanted to give it all the time. So she started keeping these motherhood journals. She agonized over everything. She yelled. She eventually had 2 more daughters and a son, and all of those grew to adulthood. And in her motherhood journals, she would write, I sinned with my tongue. I yelled at Alice, and I feel really bad about it. There was Mary, the oldest daughter, with whom she got along fabulously, but Mary married a drunk and ended up having to come back home. There was Alice, who was exactly like her mother. They argued like cats and dogs her whole life. And then there was Ned, the son, who became a doctor, and they got along very well. So she had 3 children, but she was prickly. She was never comfortable in her role as either a wife or a mother. And I'm reading all this stuff at the Stowe Center thinking, oh, I like her because she's human, because I've never read about her, and look at her. And at that point, I didn't know anything other than, I like her. This is a pretty cool old woman, dead now, but I wish I'd known her. And I keep reading, and she becomes this force to be reckoned with in Hartford, genteel Hartford. We'll talk about abolitionism up to a point, but then it's cruel and crude to talk about it further. And she kept pushing the issue, she and John. Because all those articles that he'd given her and the books he'd given her, she was now ignited and excited. Now, like a lot of early suffragists, she cut her teeth on the abolition movement. Early on, women who were working on ending slavery started to say, excuse me, are we talking about just the black men? Because the black women, by the way, me too, they should be allowed to vote. Why can't women vote? And what they were told by the movers and shakers, most of them, in the abolition movement was, sit tight. And what they said was, this is the Negro's hour. We will concentrate on ending slavery, and then we'll come back and take care of you. And that's not what happened. They concentrated on ending slavery, and then when the women who had thrown themselves into this movement looked around and said, okay, it's our turn, where are you? Crickets. So many of the people who had promised to then help the women get the vote, black women, white women, every woman, disappeared, except for William Lloyd Garrison, except for Frederick Douglass, and oddly, Henry Ward Beecher was willing to still be on the line. So Isabella started writing about women. And she was a little jealous of Harriet. In fact, she wrote John at one point, especially when all the mail was coming in bags every day from people so grateful for Uncle Tom's Cabin. She wrote her husband and said, I love Harriet. I'm so happy for her. But every time I look around, I see how little I am. Look what she's done. I'm a Beecher. I need to be doing more. Beyond raising these children, beyond being your wife, beyond everything I'm doing. So she tried her hand at writing a magazine article. She was responding to a satirical article in Atlantic Magazine, which still publishes, called Ought Women to Learn the Alphabet? And the author decided, no, if they're not going to vote, why should they know how to read? It was satire, and Isabella got it. And she wrote the author of that article and said, you know, I've been writing a little bit. Now, everybody knew she was a Beecher. So the editor said, oh, send it to me. So she sent him this fake conversation between a married couple. The man and woman are arguing back and forth whether a woman ought to vote. And it's written by Isabella Beecher Hooker. So the man is kind of stupid and the woman wins all the arguments. And she sent it off to Atlantic Magazine. And the editor probably didn't know how big a knife this was in her gut. The editor said, oh, this is radical. Your sister can write radical stuff, but I'm not sure you can. So she put it in a drawer and just felt awful. Oh, my gosh. But then it was like that's lit a candle underneath her, more like a fire, because she started to write the movers and shakers in the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, and they all wrote back. And they wrote back specifically because she was a Beecher. And they wrote back because they figured a Beecher has money. Most of them didn't. She did. And they figured if they have the Beecher name, it's like a huge endorsement. That would be great. So they all started pairing and trying to get her to join our side. The women's movement had split into two groups over a lot of things, not just personalities. Mostly it was over how best to effect getting the right to vote for women. Do we have a constitutional amendment, or do we have to do it state by state and then go through the Supreme Court? And that happens a lot. And there was disagreement as to that. Again, there were personalities. There was the Boston group and the New York group. And they were both lobbying to get Isabella to join them. And she ended up picking the New York group, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, not because she necessarily agreed with their tactics, but because they were nicer. The Boston group said nasty things about the New York group. The New York group didn't say nasty things about the Boston group. She was a minister's daughter. She'll go with the nicer people. Now, both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony weren't that nice. They were great strategists. And you could not tire these women out. They traveled, they spoke. Susan B. Anthony cast a vote, was fined $100, never paid it. Good for you, Susan. They went back and forth, and they liked her, but Isabella Beecher Hooker was a Beecher. So there's an exchange of letters between Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton where they're going, get her, she's like a new convert. Oh my God, she drives me crazy. At one point, Isabella Beecher Hooker wrote Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wanted to bring her to Hartford. She was a big name. If you bring her to Hartford, maybe you can convince people that rights for women to vote is the coming thing. Elizabeth Cady Stanton wasn't sure if she could work it into her schedule, so Isabella wrote her and said, well, come to Hartford. It's fine if you do. If you don't, there's more time for me to talk. Oh, and send $100. We're going to buy food. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton shoots a letter to Susan B. Anthony like, oh, my God, get her. But she sent $100 for food and stayed off the podium so that Isabella Beecher Hooker could talk. Because what it turned out was Isabella was a really good speaker. And she started the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association, and she wouldn't speak at the first 2 years of annual meetings because she was so nervous about it. And then she spoke, and she found her voice. I mean, she was a Beecher. And it really started to look like women were going to get the vote. Post the Civil War, it looked like in the early 1870s, women would get the right to vote. They were getting everyone on board with this. There were still people who were concerned, including Catherine, who, as much as she believed that women should be educated, did not believe that women should vote because voting would sully a woman's moral compass. Politics are dirty, women are clean. So it's best if you just raise your children and you raise your men to run the country, you raise your daughters, your women, to raise more sons to run the country. And she was a proponent of something called the Republican Mother Movement, small r, not big R, not like the political party. A Republican mother, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. I'll raise my sons to run the country. I'll raise my daughters to raise their sons to run the country. So it's power once removed. That's how Catherine felt. Harriet Beecher Stowe felt the same way. She refused to come out and really talk about the suffrage movement. She might have wanted to vote, but she didn't lend support to it. And there was Isabella. And there are those letters where she's trying to cajole her siblings. You've got to get involved in this. This is important. I do not want to die and not have a say in where the ship of state is going. Henry Ward Beecher was on board. In fact, he was quite a supporter of the suffrage movement. In 1870, Isabella decided that she would try to be proactive. Now, she can't vote, but she would try to be proactive, and she and John wrote a property law for the state of Connecticut. It didn't pass. They reintroduced it in 71, didn't pass, kept going back every year until 1877, and the state legislature finally passed this property law, which made Connecticut really unusual for allowing women to own property. Now I'm at the sex scandal. Are you with me? This is where it gets weird. So you have Henry Ward Beecher, who was this fiery proponent of abolitionism. In fact, he went outside what most people would think the boundaries would be for a minister. At one point, he funded shipments of Sharps rifles to be sent out to the part of the country, Bleeding, Kansas, the part of the country where I'm from, where the fighting was vicious, to try to decide which state would be slave, which state would be free. And people called those rifles Beecher's Bibles. Most ministers might not think it's okay to send guns, but he did. So you wanted him on your side. And he was on the side of the women's movement, and then his reputation caught up with him. It used to be said, and his church is still there in Brooklyn, that when Henry Ward Beecher gave a sermon on Sunday, no less than a dozen of his mistresses were in the audience to listen to it. He had a reputation. If you knew his wife Eunice, you almost said, I can see that. That's not a good excuse for going outside the marital bounds, but Eunice was icky. Everyone thought so, including Henry Ward. But it was one of those things where we just don't talk about it. He was still a man of the cloth. People appreciated and respected him. And then one of those mistresses sang like a bird. She found a newspaper editor, also a female, fascinating woman, Victoria Woodhull. Look her up, Woodhull. She ran for president in 1876. She was a stockbroker. She may have been a prostitute. I don't judge. But she also had a newspaper. And this particular woman went to her to say she had had an affair with Henry Ward Beecher. Now, the reason Victoria Woodhull decided to go ahead and blast this out there was she was also a proponent of something called the free love movement. You love whom you love, and marriage is bondage, and no one should be married. You should be able to go from partner to partner, consenting adults. She believed Henry Ward Beecher, by the way he lived, believed that as well. She thought he was a hypocrite. She could excuse him going outside his marital bounds, but she could not excuse that in the pulpit he was a man of God who loved his wife. He may have loved his wife, but he was rotten at showing it. So she published this article, the Beechers were furious. And they circled the wagons. My brother is a man of God. He would never do this, except one. Guess who? Isabella. Isabella talked to the woman. She believed the woman was telling the truth. The woman was telling the truth. And so while all the other Beechers are saying, Henry Ward is a man of God, he would never do this, you had Isabella saying, he did this, he needs to repent. And she was one of those people who would say one thing too many. Do you have friends like that? It's like, stop talking. Oh, God, there you went. She said, he should repent, and I will take over his church while he gets right with God. It's like, don't say that part, but she did. Nobody wanted that. So you had a church trial where the members of the jury were all handpicked by Henry Ward. Guess what they decided? Then you had a regular trial. I mean, it got crazy. And in fact, there is a Pulitzer-winning biography by Debbie Applegate on Henry Ward Beecher called The Most Famous Men in America. And she looks at this trial. I mean, there was no newspaper that didn't cover this. You don't remember Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky? This was 10 times as awful. All the details, and people are reading it. They can't wait to read this. This is awesome. Sex in my newspaper. Yay! They loved it. So that pretty much removed Henry Ward Beecher from any kind of effectiveness in discussing women's rights. No one's going to listen to him. They want him to talk about Elizabeth Tilton, his girlfriend. They want to ask him about Eunice. They want to ask him about his other mistresses. Exactly. So that basically, his ignorance derailed the women's movement for decades. They could never get it back on track. And guess who suffered the most? When Henry Ward Beecher died, his obituary did not mention either trial or the fact that he could not stay within his marriage vows. Isabella never, ever recovered from people being angry at her because she took a stand and said, my brother's in the wrong. They could never forgive her for that. It wasn't the fact that she was telling the truth, it was the fact that she went against the Beechers. Both Mary and Harriet started a rumor that Isabella was crazy. And they would give interviews like that. And once you only have to have one person say in print, you're crazy. And there it is. You're crazy. But she wasn't. She was just strong and outspoken. So that was one strike against her, and it was huge. Here's the other one. You have a spiritualist church over there, right? On High Street? Is that the way to High Street? The spiritualist movement started around the time it really gained popularity during the Civil War. And if you're a spiritualist, you believe that the veil separating living and dead is pretty thin. So I can still talk to dead people if I'm on their wavelength, right? You have a spiritualist church where they do this. It's fascinating. And I don't discount it. I don't necessarily embrace it. But so many people dabbled in spiritualism during that time. Abraham Lincoln dabbled. Mary Todd Lincoln, more than dabbled. Mark Twain, who made part of his living making fun of spiritualism, his wife was healed by a spiritualist healer when she was a teenager. She was paralyzed until a spiritualist healer came in and laid hands on her, and yet he made fun of it. Isabella never dabbled in anything. She went whole hog. So she believed you could still talk to the dead, which was fine if you didn't talk about it so much, but she did. And she became a proponent of mediums and being able to be in touch and getting some knowledge from people who've gone on before. During all this Henry Ward sex scandal, she and John disappeared to Europe for a while. In fact, they rented their house out to Mark Twain during that time. It was in the 1870s, 1875, 76. And while she was in Europe, I think it was Paris, she woke up at a hotel room and saw a vision of her dead mother, who'd come back from the grave to tell her to be strong. Oh, and here's how you get that stain out of muslin tablecloths. I guess if you're going to travel that far, you might as well be practical. Okay, if my mother or grandmother came back to me to give me household tips, I'd be a little concerned, but she did. And she gained great strength from that. And she wouldn't not talk about it. So unlike other people who dabbled with it, she talked about it a lot. And so you had her sister saying she was crazy. You had her breaking from the Beechers. John broke too, and he never suffered. In fact, John wrote her a letter at one point during all the discussion about Henry Ward and said, I may die. It was Victorian times. Everyone was looking forward to death. I may die on this trip I'm going on, but if you side with your brother, I will come back and haunt you. You know he's wrong. Okay. So she had his support at least. So you had that her sister saying she's crazy. She talks to the dead. And she wouldn't let go of this women's vote thing. She wasn't polite about it. She was pushy. She was a woman. That was a problem. And she kept pushing, and she would hold meetings in her home, and when the younger women didn't want to talk about suffragism, it made them uncomfortable, she called them political science clubs. And she would have sandwiches and tea in her Hartford mansion, and then she would turn the conversation from political science at large to wouldn't you like to vote? And try to get them that way. She learned to drive a car so she could drive around Connecticut and convince people you need to vote. You have to vote. Women need the vote. And every year she would speak at the annual convention, and she would bring in these big names, and then John died in 1901. And in her motherhood journal, she believed that she could spirit write. She would sit in a big chair upstairs in her bedroom on Hawthorne Street, and she would hold a pen, and she would get quiet, and she believed the spirit would make her write. There's one journal where her writing's this way, and then all of a sudden it really changes drastically, and it's Napoleon. And Napoleon saying things through her spirit writing, oh my gosh, I'm talking through the body of a woman, I'm not sure I like this. Has anyone seen Josephine? I'm going to go. And then she would go back to writing that way. That's weird, right? But it wasn't that uncommon. And she sat for days waiting for John to come back to her. And that was like half of her gone. It was an incredible marriage. It was a marriage of equals. He died, and then she kind of closed in on herself, but she kept sending money. In fact, for the longest time in Connecticut, the suffrage movement was based on hooker money. She just kept pouring money at it, thinking, we've got to do this. She would occasionally give speeches. She traveled between Hartford and a home out in Norfolk, which I just saw last week, and it's really ugly yellow right now. She'd hate it. And then she got sick, and then she had a stroke. And then on January 25th, 1907, she died. And like so many of the women in the early suffrage movement, she died without voting. I hope they're in heaven having a beer. I hope they're happy, because they never got to realize that one goal. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, none of them. Well, Susan B. Anthony did vote that one time. It was illegal, but good for her. She at least tried. And that was who I got to know. So I wrote the piece. It wasn't very good. I turned it in. It was on time, and I thought, I wish I could have done a better job. And I did so much research that I didn't include in the little story that I wrote. And I kept talking about her. And I was writing a column at the time, and I kept inserting her in columns. I would write about highway safety and throw in Isabella Beecher Hooker. She didn't belong in there, but you need to know this woman. And one Sunday morning, my husband and I are walking around Branford. We don't live there. We like to pretend we do. And there was one of those plaques on the side of a house, 1853. We've been married a long time. I think he was talking about a boat he wanted to buy. I wasn't exactly listening, but 1853. And I interrupted him, and I said, oh, 1853. That's the year the Hookers moved into their Hartford mansion. You're welcome. And he stopped, and his shoulders slumped, and he said, please, Jesus, can you just write a book about her and stop talking? So I did, but look what I'm doing right now. I'm talking about her. So I wrote a book, and I turned it in. And once again, I'm agonizing over, it's not a good book. It doesn't capture her. This woman was on fire. She took no before its time. She was awesome. She swam against the tide. She was her own person. All of culture was telling her, be a mother, be a wife, and nothing else. And she said no. I turned the book in. And then I did one of the stupidest things I've ever done, other than some vandalism when I was a teenager in Webb City, Missouri, for which I'm heartily sorry. Not really, it was fun. I was talking to the editor, and she said, so I haven't opened the file, how'd it go? And I'm like, it's not as good a book as it could be. I don't feel like I captured her. And so the editor said, oh, you can write another one. Oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to write a second book. I already wrote that book. I need to move on. She said, no, take this back and write it again. Okay, what? I'm done. You don't understand. I met the deadline. I'm done. It's fine. It's a fine book. It's not great. No, I'd like to see what you do with it if you have fun. Okay. So I took it back. I rewrote the whole thing. I used the word thee in several places in the same place. Everything else was different. Because I decided if I'm going to have this one shot, no one's written about her. She appears in books and she's dismissed quickly. She's crazy. That's all she gets. For all the work she did, that's all you can give her? So I rewrote the book. I had a seance to see if I could contact her. I don't know if I did. It was during a hurricane. The lights went out. I was scared. And I didn't tell the medium who I was looking for because I thought she might cheat. And of course, my father shows up, my grandma shows up, and it's almost like, get out of the way. You're not who I want to see. And then there's a woman with white hair and a long dress. Right. Okay. Yeah, that's her. And he begins to describe her. And he says, she's been trying to talk to you. The lights go out right then. And it's a hurricane. The lights are out all over the town. And I'm thinking, I got to go. This is weird. And she says, yeah, she's been trying to talk to you. And she always worried that she was a bad mother. And she kept journals, And I'm thinking, okay. Because the family for years wouldn't let anyone read those journals because they were afraid it would reinforce the idea that she was crazy. I read every one of them. It only made me think she was interesting. Okay, she kept journals. That medium has no way of knowing that. And she really wants to talk about this particular newspaper editor she really liked. Okay, and she said the guy's name. He was in Springfield. That was a very good family friend. And she said, you're incarnated from that newspaper editor. And I'm thinking, I don't feel that at all, because the guy had a beard. I'm nothing like that. And sometimes he made ethical decisions that were wrong. And I'm thinking, he did. Huh? How would that medium know that? And then she starts to describe her house in Hartford. And again, I've said nothing. I didn't say, I want to look up this dead woman. The only thing that medium asked me is, are you related? No. Has she been dead a long time? Yes. Evidently, if you're dead a long time, you vibrate differently. If it's recent, it's easier to find you. I don't know. I don't write these rules. So she's talking about her. And then she says, she wants you to know she likes your president. Barack Obama. She likes your president. She likes your first lady. But as it was when she was alive, the man gets the country, the woman gets the cause. Who cares about fat kids? Let's move. She's talking about let's move. Because Michelle Obama, her initiative is to get kids, fat kids. I wouldn't say it like that, but okay, that's blunt. But all right, that sounds like her. And she's talking and she's talking and she's saying more. And it's like, how would she know that? She felt guilty for having so much money because she grew up poor, and suddenly she had money and she gave a lot of it away. True, John Hooker used to tell her, stop writing checks. You don't have to give money to everyone who comes to the door. Yeah, I do. And then time's up. My money is out. The ding dings, and it's time to end. And the medium said, yeah, well, if you ever want to talk to her again, and I think I said something like, I'm not paying you. I'm done. The lights come on right then. And it came on everywhere. It wasn't like someone flicking this woman's switch. And she said, oh, no, you don't have to contact me. She's been with you the whole time. Huh, that's weird. Yeah, she wanted you to write about her. Have you written about her? And what I wanted to ask was, Isabella, have you read the manuscript? Is it any good? Or should I start all over again? And I thought, I can't ask. She came from the grave. That's stupid. So I got out of there as quick as I could, and I rewrote the whole thing. I don't know if I actually contacted her. I only know I tried. And I only know that on this effort, Tempest Toss, I tried. I still don't think I captured her. I still don't think I did a good job. And it's not because, I'm falsely modest. I have no modesty whatsoever. It's just I know this woman. So here's how I tuck myself in at night for feeling like maybe I didn't capture her even this time, is that there are so many women who get pushed off the historical page for really crappy reasons. They're crazy. They're not the right color. They didn't involve themselves in the things that women are supposed to be involved in. And so we don't have to know about them. And so we miss these stories. Like Isabella Beecher Hooker wrote the property law, held the women's movement together in significant ways, not just in Connecticut, but she traveled everywhere. She went down to D.C. to testify before some senators. She didn't like the way the room was set up because the senators were here, the people were behind her. So she told the senators, I want you to come over here because actually you work for them. And they did. They grumbled the whole time. But she moved the senators out with regular people. And then she spoke. And she spoke beautifully. And she wrote beautifully. And when she died, the Hartford Courant in her obit said, Mrs. Hooker suffered from an agony of personality. Does that sound good to you? If I die, and I will, and the Hartford Courant says I suffered from an agony of personality, I swear to God, I'm coming back, and I'm going to kick the head of whatever editor is running that place. How dismissive. And then there was a trial that fought over her will. And the headline was, Mrs. Hooker talked to spirits. So did Abraham Lincoln. Are you making fun of him? I didn't think so. She got pushed off the page for the stupidest reasons. So the way I tuck myself in at night is, okay, I put her back on there. And even cooler, 2 days ago, a little girl named Lizzie, who's going to do National History Day, somehow chose Isabella Beecher Hooker. Someone put her in touch with me. She asked me these great questions. I answered as best I could, probably way more than she needs, because I can take a conversation, send it to the corner, and kick it to death on this. And she emailed me yesterday and showed me her finished product. It's beautiful. So I emailed her and said, here's how you pay me, because she was so grateful. Oh, I've never met anyone who wrote a book, whatever. Here's how you pay me. You go through college, you get little chops underneath of you, and then you come back and do another book on Isabella Beecher Hooker. Do it better, be honest, and I will stand in line to buy it, because her story needs to be told. And I can't wait to see how it's told from here. This is just a start. And look in your own family. Look at the women in your family who maybe people don't talk about as much. Those are your movers and shakers. And those are the people we need to know. And I'm done. Thank you.